Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second session of the morning, following a very interesting discussion of some of the local government leaders. We're going to switch to three of our regional powerhouses who have been both doing ambitious things in OGP, but of course also have challenges in OGP. And really the theme of this session is exploring ambition. How do we use the OGP action plans more ambitiously? Where can we push further on different topics that citizens really care about? How can we have real, deep, meaningful participatory processes that lead to specific reforms in OGP? I'm going to be speaking very little because we have 9 panelists and only 1 hour. So just some house rules for this session. I'm going to be very strict on keeping all of our panelists to 3 minutes of initial remarks. Megan at the front here has a sign that will give you a 30-second warning. So I will be very strict just to be fair to everybody and make sure everyone has a chance to speak. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some comments and reflections from the audience, and then we'll give everybody 1 more minute at the end to reflect on what they've heard. So this will be a rapid session. I'll be moderating in English, but people will be speaking in Spanish or English as you wish. So very, very briefly, I'll just run down the line and just so you know who everyone is, and then we'll get started. So to my immediate left, I think most people will know Nati Kafi, the point of contact for the government of Argentina. And thanks again for hosting this wonderful summit. To her left is Renzo Lavin, one of the civil society leaders, who's been one of the 2 civil society leaders, I think, in the forum on the Argentina OGP process. And then further to the left, we have Ines Posodela, the independent reporting mechanism researcher for Argentina. Next, we have the Canadian delegation. They're nicely in order here. So we have Jean-Noé Landré from Open North Canada, from civil society. We have Michael Karanicolis, the IRM researcher from Canada. And we have Jamie Boyd, the point of contact from the government of Canada. And then finally, we have the Colombian delegation. So we have Aura Maria Cifuentes Hayo, the POC, lead from the government side, followed by Nicolas Martin, from Somos Mas in Colombia, from civil society. And finally, we have Jose Hernandez Bonavento from the independent reporting mechanism. So we have 9 wonderful speakers, and I'm going to start with the 3 civil society leads. And maybe we can just start on my left with Renzo. And the question I'd like to explore with the civil society leads is tell us a bit about highlighting one of the ambitious things that you think your country has done through OGP, but also an area you would like them to go further. And that's the question I'd like to pose to all 3 of the civil society leads, but starting with Renzo.
Gracias. Hola, muy buenos días a todos y a todas.
Hello and good morning, everybody. It is very difficult to be the first. Replying to Joe's question, I think the first big success of the open government process in Argentina was to expand the agenda. We were talking in our past agenda of digital technology, open data, and not much more. And I think the big step forward was to talk about open government in a more comprehensive manner: citizenship participation, transparency, accountability, anti-corruption policies, And that was done through the incorporation to the debate, and Nati from the Ministry of Modernization was a big responsible for this. We brought to the discussion table the other areas that should be sitting at the table. People from the Ministry of Health, Education, Housing, the entire rights agenda that should be part of the open government debate, as well as institutions involved in anti-corruption fight, the Anti-Corruption Office, funding of political parties, procurement and contracting, the judiciary, the legislature, the provinces, the provincial government. So the big success and the major outcome was to bring the open government debate to take it to a different level and to plant the seed in the state agents. People who had never heard about open government in the past are strong advocates and promoters of this fight. If I may flip the coin, I think that the major challenge and the deficit of our open government process is to go deeper into it. We're still on the surface. I think we haven't even yet touched a single fiber of the political and institutional system of how our state relates to citizenship, to citizens. Major decisions are still made behind closed doors by groups from politics behind the citizens. The legislative and the judiciary are still at the service of the people in power. So we should go deeper so that concrete commitments of open government permeate the functioning of the state for a more profound democracy and institutions able to respond to the citizens' problems.
Thank you very much, President.
So two challenges, and let's see if Jean-Noé can build on those from a Canadian perspective. And by the way, model timekeeping for everybody. Please, if you can follow Renzo, that would be excellent. So Jean-Noé, Canada is about to launch its first permanent forum of government civil society. You also have your new action plan next year, so we'd be interested to hear from you on both the opportunities you see and some of the challenges.
Absolutely. So I think it's important just to give a bit of context in terms of where we've come from in Canada, because in many, in the eyes of a lot of people internationally, Canada is a leader when it comes to open data and open government. But before this government, the new government that's in place right now, many Canadians actually did not really associate the Canadian government as a leader on open government. So the OGP has actually given us quite a good opportunity to be able to kind of really reach out to civil society across the country and mobilize and organize ourselves differently, to seize that opportunity and to go beyond, rhetoric around kind of open dialogue, but really get into co-creation and then eventually, hopefully, get into co-implementation, which is really a goal that we want to achieve. So what we did to seize this opportunity with the change of government was to create and to put in place the Canadian Open Government Civil Society Network. So before we actually started negotiating and talking to government about setting up a multi-stakeholder forum, we needed to have a better mechanism in order to kind of reach out and have the ability to socialize the value added of the OGP. Most people did not know what the OGP was, or even if you started talking about open data and things like that, it didn't really connect to them. The relevance, there was a relevance gap that existed there. So it took us about a year to negotiate the details of the multi-stakeholder forum. We've now had a competition. 16 candidates were kind of shortlisted, and now we're in the final kind of leg of that process to put in place that mechanism. There's obviously going to be a lot of challenges associated with putting in place the forum. Even if you have leaders that are sitting at the table, gaining access access to different agencies as opposed to only focusing on our main interlocutors at Treasury Board. As much as it's great and nice to work with Treasury Board, we want to be able to have kind of deeper access to decision makers to understand the context of how they would want to kind of really seize the opportunity and to understand, like, you know, how can we kind of co-create these commitments. I think there's going to be also a challenge on just really getting into kind of deeper types of commitments, especially on open data, getting past kind of volume of data, but looking at issue-specific types of commitments where data can actually be quite useful from climate change perspective or other types of issues. And then the last challenge that I can mention is probably the big challenge that we have obviously in Canada is interoperability, right? And coordinating across jurisdictions on such a large, geographical territory. And the Open Data Charter has been actually quite useful as a way of being able to, not necessarily harmonizing our policies, but at least have a common language on how we can coordinate the way that we can work across jurisdictions as well.
Great, thanks very much, Jean-Noé. The final civil society speaker I want to hear from is Nicolas. Some of you may know that the independent reporting mechanism had awarded Canada the most starred commitments of any country in the region, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. So I'd like to hear from you on the same question, please.
Sí, el de Colombia, te refieres.
You mean Colombia? You mean Colombia? I think that the big success of this was the creation of a collective working space, civil society and government. In Colombia, typically, this relationship between civil society and government is conflictive, most of all on these issues. So making progress towards a space for construction and dialogue is extremely valuable. It was very difficult to attain, and it is difficult to maintain. In order to have good action plans and good work in Colombia is because we have many good public servants that take this notion in their hearts. And commitments come from the bottom, move upwards from the bottom. There are people who are able to connect these scattered dots and show them as a collective and give them space and a new breath so that they can get support and to work the commitments jointly with the citizens. As far as the future challenges are concerned, one of these challenges is to expand participation and to move away from scattered challenges and commitments to a state policy. In Chile, in Uruguay, they have been working on this because we have to have a better organization. We have been worn out in this connecting of scattered efforts. So if we could have a better participation, and this is our self-criticism, how civil society could go to grassroots organizations to institutionalize the spaces. Throughout the years in the Secretariat of Transparency, the lead from the government side, there is a back and forth depending on who's in office, and there is a big turnover. So if a team could be institutionalized and mechanisms could be institutionalized as it happened elsewhere, that would be very valuable. Likewise, the accompaniment by the institutional setting, the OECD, the OAS, because the government will pay more attention to international fora than to civil society sometimes. So if they could accompany us along the process, they could help to consolidation. Irrespective of how favorable the environment is after the next elections, well, supporting these initiatives, irrespective of which politicians are in office, That would be helpful. And also subnational work. We know, irrespective of who's in office, we know that there are civil society and public servants that have made a strong bet on this.
So if I can, I guess, pull out two threads. One is, I think, the quality of the space for dialogue we've heard from the three civil society speakers has been improving, although it still could go deeper, and it could still go to more challenging topics, as Renzo said, challenging some of those vested interests in the state that are, very hard political issues to take on. But also that we need to have, I think, as Nicolas said, this involvement of other parts of the government and the state, the judiciary, the parliament, and bringing more of those actors in, so we have a more sustainable, open government ecosystem in the countries through transitions, as Colombia will experience. I want to turn now to the three independent reporting mechanism researchers we have here. I think most of you know the IRM by now. If you don't, then you're missing out. I think for some of the colleagues here, I know the Haitian delegation is here. If you read the independent reporting mechanism reports, you get a very deep understanding on what each country is doing with a commitment by commitment analysis on challenges and also where they're doing well. So they're really a treasure trove of information on every country in OGP. And I want to pose the question to the three researchers: what would your recommendation be for more ambition in the country where you have been leading the research? And maybe we can start with Inés.
Okay, thank you, Joe, and gracias a todos por estar aquí.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you all for being here. First of all, let me say that indeed, from the evaluator point of view, Argentina has made a significant progress in terms of ambition. By Argentina, I do not mean the Argentine government, but the government and civil society together. Because the progress started when there was this connection between both, with the merit on the civil society side of not being just this entity that is hovering over and being persuasive, because this is the intent we have, to push the government to do more and move forward. Now, specifically on how we have gone deeper in ambition, we have to see the various complementary ways of thinking ambition. And here, I will try to refer to three of them. The first, in order to go deeper in terms of the ambition in action plans, we need a better balance between the open government values reflecting commitments. There has been a significant bias in terms of transparency and data opening, open data, portals, websites, etc., that very few people afterwards visit or look back. So one of the recommendations of the mechanisms was not to neglect the dimension of accountability. And it is true that the third action plan pays more attention to this dimension. There is a conscious effort to include this dimension of accountability, but it is true that it is the most difficult dimension to take on and understand by the stakeholders themselves. It is difficult to visualize a concrete manner of implementing this dimension through mechanisms for the citizens to call for the state accountability. And there are some mechanisms that are labeled as accountability, but actually call for the inputs for accountability mechanisms, but do not take on the process themselves. Second, in terms of the most visited dimensions, which are participation and transparency, there is also room for going deeper here. In terms of participation, we intend to go upwards in this ladder towards empowerment and co-creation. And then In terms of data transparency, again, going deeper in the ambition involves paying attention to the use or non-use of data. And to conclude in just 10 seconds, we call for a deeper ambition by including the most secretive or harsh topics in civil society, such as procurement and contracting, funding of political parties, and other non-typical topics, non-prevalent in the organizations dealing with open government, such as the daily life of citizens. And the recommendation that has been made to do horizontal and vertical spreading of the open government commitments, which poses obstacles for ambition. Ambition with a contextual view, but let's discuss it in the future.
Thank you, Inez. Very, very clear recommendations on moving to accountability commitments, on moving beyond consultation to real empowerment and co-creation, and on bringing in some of the toughest political issues into OGP. I think all of those three resonate very strongly. Michael, Canada is the only country here that will do a new OGP plan next year, because Argentina, Colombia have just launched new ones. So your recommendations will be crucial for that process. So let us know how it should be done.
Yeah, I think that context is also important to answer this question. And it's important to note that coming into this latest action plan cycle, Canada was emerging from a very dark place from the perspective of open government. We had the Information Commissioner publicly pleading for funds to keep the lights on. We had the use of the tax regulatory authority to target political opponents. It was a very negative time in terms of open government. And since the last election, a lot of that has turned around, which is very important. There's been a crucial change of direction that basically accompanied the start of this current action plan cycle. But at the same time, the progress that we've seen has largely been incremental. And again, this action plan has been incredibly broad, which is also important in that it's moving Canada forward on a lot of different fronts, but fundamentally it's looking at incremental progress. And that's why, coming into this current action plan cycle, Canada is at a bit of a crossroads because we're getting to the point where the low-hanging fruit has been plucked, and there's a bit of a choice between continuing on the road of slow and incremental reform, or taking a more ambitious approach and really establishing Canadian leadership on openness issues. Canada as a global leader. And I don't think we're there at the moment. I think that there are Canadians in positions of global leadership, but I wouldn't place Canada there at the moment. But I think that there's real potential with this current action plan to put Canada onto the world stage. In terms of how that can be done, the ideas are there. I know that the ideas are there because I heard them in my consultations for preparing this latest IRM report. And I think that the key to improving ambition within the next action plan largely lies with a stronger role for civil society, a stronger role in co-creation and, as you mentioned, co-implementation. And that needs to be matched with the political will to take on these difficult challenges, take on challenges that go beyond incremental progress. And again, to be fair, we've now received, there's a lot of signs that the coming consultation process is going to be miles ahead of what we saw in previous cycles. The fact that it's already starting up for the 2018 action plan is an incredibly positive sign. It's a long process. There's this new multi-stakeholder engagement mechanism, which should provide a stronger place for civil society at the table. But fundamentally, time will tell. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the road ahead in terms of more ambitious and stronger commitments, in terms of specific recommendations. Again, it's civil society has been saying this stuff for years. Stronger reform of the Access to Information Act, beneficial registry of ownership, proper support for Canada's open government pioneers, both within government and in the nonprofit sector. There's a lot of very important issues that can be addressed and that we hopefully will see addressed in the current action plan.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for also, in a sense, moving to some specifics of, what are the topics such as beneficial ownership transparency, which is an emerging open government norm in OGP, access to information, obviously a hot issue in Canada at the moment, where we really need to see leadership if Canada is to step up to be the co-chair of OGP. Finally, for the IRM section, let me turn to Jose to give your assessment of Colombia, both, if you can, the previous plans that you would have assessed, but also how you see ambition in the new plan.
Gracias. Bueno,
Thank you. Some context at the beginning. The action plan, the second action plan, well, now we are in the phase of completing the final report for the second action plan. Initially, the commitments were based on actions that had already been put forward in the National Development Plan of the Colombian government. That was an advantage to us because it allowed us to have the capabilities to implement the actions that were already included in that plan, both from the point of view of human and material resources. But in the third plan, we started improving on the co-creation component. But at a given point, we could think that the action plan was like a shopping list. And we were just putting all the actions that could be coordinated into an open government plan and not as a systemic plan. So that will be the last recommendation I will elaborate on. So we needed more co-creation. I think that we are already working on that. In light of the third plan, I think that the contact point will talk about this. The second aspect that we should highlight is the role of civil society. The work that has been done, as Nicolas said, is very interesting. There was a horizontal dialogue between the officials from different ministries and different institutions with different civil society organizations. There was a horizontal dialogue. But in this process, they discuss more about the process itself and not so much about monitoring. And I think that there lies an element that could lead to more co-creation. We also need to broaden this to other people, and we can do that through monitoring. This is an exercise that was already put into practice by Colombia, and that was in the commitment socialization tables, but that was a specific initiative to deal with this. But I think that we can coordinate better with the civil society through monitoring. They will not necessarily have to be in all the spaces, but we need the monitoring with the support of the civil society with a progress report. And in conclusion, what I could say is that it would be very important to do a lot of advertising. So we are here as an example, so we should take advantage of that. We should disseminate more information about OGP in the country in order to make it more institutionalized in the future. And it would be interesting to put together a medium-term plan with a specific target that we want to meet, because we cannot continue working on a shopping list where we are just putting things that we need urgently. We need to look ahead and see where we want to get that.
Thank you very much. So clearly a whole set of recommendations around the co-creation process and how we do that more deeply, but I think also helpfully you were coming up with a possible solution, which I think many countries face a challenge with, around raising awareness to citizens as well as civil society, and actually having a broader participation, which I think could be a very interesting new direction for OGP, is how do you actually get direct citizen engagement in some of this planning. So we're giving the final word before I will turn to the audience, to the three government leads for each of the countries. First up, I'll turn to Nati. If you haven't read the Argentina Action Plan, I really encourage you to do so. It does have 44 commitments, so IEP members, you can talk to Nati after about your about having to assess that. But it is a very interesting plan, and I think one of the big developments from the process, at least from my understanding, is this real attempt to go to the local governments and go subnational in terms of bringing in their views. So my question for each of you will be, what has been a major challenge that you faced in terms of opening this process to more stakeholders, and where do you see the potential to use OGP more ambitiously in terms of commitments in the future?
Hola, buen día a todos.
Good morning to you all. Regarding the third action plan that is currently under execution, the ambitious was reflected in the process to put together that plan, because we challenge ourselves to try to incorporate the other powers, the other branches of power, and the provinces too. We wanted to broaden participation, and the team that is made up of 40 people also focus on reaching out to the provinces. It was impossible to do that from our own team, so we started working with the different open government offices in the provincial governments. And I think that we were able to take a major step forward, because this implied that civil society organizations have to did not have to come to the capital city and work there. So we were able to broaden the participation in that way. So we strengthened the dialogue tables in each of the provinces. They continue with their conversations regardless of the co-created commitments for the plan. One of the major challenges for the next cycle, that will be in 2019, but we now have to think about that, is to improve communication, to make sure that more organizations can get on board. Although we have been able to successfully broaden the participation, we increased the number of commitments, the number of institutions, the number of organizations in this plan, this is still a conversation that has not permeated everywhere. So in that regard, we will have to do some redesigning together with the national team to improve the methodology and to bring in more organizations. Probably we can continue with the methodology focus on vertical discussions. So different commitments were discussed in different tables. So organizations that perhaps may say, well, I don't work with open government issues, well, but you work on water, so you can participate in this discussion. So they were able to have a space to discuss their core issues through these vertical discussions. So now, looking at the number of people that are working on this, effectively, we want to reach out to more organizations and more individuals so that they can join us in the co-creation tables. And we will also have the challenge of putting forward fewer commitments. We need to broaden participation, strengthen commitments, and make sure that we have more challenging commitments, but at the same time to put forward fewer commitments. So we'll see how we do with that.
And I mean, just to underscore one thing you said, which I think really was an innovation that came from the Americas region in OGP, which we see as very effective, is precisely, as you say, having these dialogues on specific problems that people care about. People don't necessarily associate with open government as a term, but of course they associate with improving local services or fighting corruption or whatever issues that they really care about if we are trying to broaden the stakeholders involved in OGP. So let me next turn to Jamie. I feel like there's a kind of lot of pressure on Canada, but that should also be useful, I hope, to you in your seat. And it would be curious to hear from you on the same two questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Joe. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having us here today. I often feel like, as a Canadian, I'm crashing the party when I come to events like this, just given that you don't have a lot of participation from North America these days. In any case, for me, within the Government of Canada, we've made fairly ambitious commitments around open government. All of the mandate letters to our ministers, the letter from the Prime Minister where he gives direction to his ministers, all of them have been made open. So you can go online and you can see what all of the ministers are accountable for. And every one of those mandate letters has a sentence in there that, for me, is incredibly powerful. And it's that government and its information should be open by default. That's an incredibly exciting thing, but I think it also highlights one of the key challenges that we face right now in the Government of Canada, and that's that we don't necessarily have a culture that is able to fully support that vision. Anecdotal, but I think telling, we launched a tracker on our 22 open government commitments fairly recently, and we went across the open government coordinators that were responsible for those commitments, and we asked them to all identify challenges that they were facing in implementing the commitments. That was an incredibly painful process because I think in government we're very reticent to say that we are facing challenges. We'd like to say, no, everything's perfect, everything's on track. Similarly, just very recently in the last week or so, the Government of Canada has launched a tracker for the mandate letter commitments, and same sort of thing. A lot of it is on track, but it really does, it's a culture change for us to say, no, some of them are not on track and some of them are no longer being pursued. So I would say that that's one of the biggest challenges. For me, strictly from an open government coordination type perspective, I would say that my biggest challenge is turning open government from a time-limited project to being simply the way we do public policy in Canada. So really transitioning from it being a small contained thing to being the culture of government. It's an exciting challenge, but it can be a relatively painful one. And I think that civil society has to play a critical role in doing that. We have the incredible luxury of having fairly robust institutions in Canada. Canadians seem to have a relatively high level of trust, declining, but certainly greater than in many countries. I see a real role for civil society in strengthening our approach to open government. In terms of the potential of open government going forward in Canada, we put quite a bit of thought into this in defining our priorities for our co-chairmanship of the Open Government Partnership. And so there, I'm sure that you've heard somebody talk about them at some point, but the three priorities that we've adopted are inclusion, so looking for ways to leverage open government to help have better inclusion for traditionally marginalized people, including by adopting a feminist approach to open government. Impact, so really making sure that the investments that we make in changing the way our government runs really does provide better services and improves the lives of Canadians. So not just that we're making noise about open government, but it's actually helping lives get better. And the third is participation. We've been very strong on open data. I think we're all extremely excited to transition and leverage that to have better participation. That's why we launched our co-creation process much earlier than we have in the past. That's why we're trying to build enthusiasm for a more participative approach.
Great, thank you very much, Jamie. And I think one of the things, if you are here and from Canada, to know is that the process has already started, right, for the next action plan in 2019. So there's going to be plenty of opportunities for input and a really deep process over 8 months. So I want to turn finally to Aura, but first, if you're in the audience, I will come to you after Aura, and just so you can start thinking about this, rather than have a lot of questions, because we have so many people here in different countries and themes, and it could go in lots of different directions. I think what would be more helpful, I would like to try and crowdsource your thoughts on how to use OGP more ambitiously. So if I can just plant that seed, we'll be looking for 30-second ideas from some of you on how you see using OGP more ambitiously. And then I'll give each person a final chance to reflect on their biggest takeaway from this session. But first to our final panelist, Aura, the point of contact from Colombia, also previously with the French government for a period of time. Colombia, again, if you haven't looked at the new plan, has a wide variety of commitments on environment, as we heard from the Secretary yesterday, on the peace-building process, on education, on social inclusion. So some really interesting topics. I think people would be curious to know, how that came about, but also what more you think you could do.
Thank you, Joe. Buenos días a todos.
Thank you all, and thank you, Joe. To answer your question, perhaps first we should explain why and how we from the Secretariat of Transparency believe that this plan is ambitious, and from this ambition, what are the challenges we will face in the next 2 years. The third action plan of Colombia at present has 27 commitments which are ambitious for 2 reasons. First, because at the beginning in Colombia we were only speaking about open government. And open government discussion required implementing actions such as open data, access to public information, etc., which were the pillars to take us to our current place, which is talking about open government. This required gathering entities that in the past had never been talking about this. We are talking about open government not only because the 3 pillars are included, but also because in the past they were never included in open government plans. At present, we have territorial entities, municipalities, so the plan is more rich in terms of the territorial perspective. And also we have the police of Colombia, because they are close to the people. When they see that citizen participation and accountability are the dimensions, having them in the plan is very important. And it is also ambitious because Colombia is in a peace agreement process, in a process of implementing certain post-conflict actions. And this posed to us challenges on making these pillars of citizen participation, accountability, and technology innovation to make them cross-cut the 6 points of the peace agreement signed with the guerrilla groups. And this is very relevant because many speakers of the panels referred to the technology, which was a digital divide, and that was clear to us in Colombia. So in this plan, we were able to establish digital analogous plans to conduct the peace agreement. And now we have commitments that go to the territories. In addition, we have digital platforms and mobile applications that provide traceability and monitoring of the plan. So you can see that challenges are many, and the 2 major ones are to work with civil society so that ordinary citizens can understand why discussing open government and relating its principles with the peace process is significant. And second, because in the 2 years we have for the plan execution, well, the challenge is to accomplish our goals.
And thanks everybody for giving time to the audience. So I'm just going to look and go across the room and looking for just quick ideas, either from your country or your perspective. What would you like to share with the room on how you think we can increase the ambition in OGP? So that's the challenge for any of you. Who would like to go first? We have one here on the left. If we could just use the microphone for translation. Thanks.
Hola, soy Ángeles.
I'm Ángeles Navarro from Mexico. I'm an activist. And as such, I'm an activist at a subnational level. And I think a major ambition would be to empower civil local associations that are not always able to attend international events, perhaps creating a subnational civil society network so that we can empower them and they act as intermediaries with the society in the hinterland.
People are shy. Coffee is coming shortly. Let's see, any other thoughts from the audience? There we go.
Muy buenos días para todos.
Good morning. I'm José Gutiérrez from the Argentinian province of Córdoba. Although we have made progress in the implementation of digital platforms and the accessibility to information and the like, an interesting proposition I've heard is to set up something similar to what our colleague has said, our activist colleague, how to involve the municipalities, how from the existing institutions we would be able to empower local organizations and therefore restore these values that are fundamental for politics, so that citizen becomes a protagonist and a participant in civil society. And the ordinary citizen is able to get involved and does not feel that his or her participation is a space generated from the state, but resulting from his or her own social, political action, enabling his or her involvement in this open government effort.
Agostina at the front here, and then one more.
Gracias.
Thanks. As Aura said, we should design action plans, I don't know if theme-based, but acting as an umbrella. You referred to the peace agreement. Well, having a theme umbrella, we have 44 commitments. It should not be a bunch of unrelated stuff, but working on guiding lines. Why not develop theme lines under a participatory framework, but perhaps basing this on themes could help us enhance the ambition and go deeper in the substance.
One here, and one here, and one here, and then we'll go back.
Hola, mi nombre es Pablo.
Hi, I'm Pablo. I work as a judge, a criminal judge, in the city of Buenos Aires, and my interest is this topic of open government. I'd like to know about your experiences with the judiciaries in the various countries, including Argentina, and what is the expectation in terms of the openness, the opening of the judiciary in general, and more specifically the courts and the judicial actors. I'd like to know what you expect from us so that we can know how we can make a contribution to something that, in my view, is very relevant, which is the principles of the OGP. Thank you.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis de Haïti. Et nous cheminons lentement mais avec détermination vers l'institution.
The speaker is just speaking in French. The interpreters apologize.
L'action de l'Argentine avec ses 44 engagements.
There is no translation from French into English. We apologize.
Travail collectif. Mais sans vouloir sauter les étapes, comment est-ce qu'on peut vraiment pérenniser ces espaces pour que le changement de gouvernement n'entraîne pas une fracture, n'est-ce pas, de ces efforts? Merci.
So I'm wondering, I caught like half of it, but
Traducir muy rápidamente de Haití, pregunta cómo hacer para...
Very quickly, the representative from Haiti is asking how to institutionalize the co-creation space for this space to be a long-lasting one.
there, yeah.
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es
Good morning. I'm Felipe from Colombia. And revisiting on this idea, I think in order to enhance ambition, we should consider the academic production on open government, the academic output. Those involved in civil society and government, they are already working on a technical grounds, but there are elements of the context that had not been explored yet. And in order to develop commitments in any space, well, a greater understanding is required of concepts such as the integration of open government in post-conflict stages, or integration of the subnational from the national level. Actually, these three governments are already working on that, but perhaps a greater academic output that would enable us to understand the phenomenon at present and in the future could enhance the ambition in the development of commitments and the reformulation of some in the light of the understanding of these concepts.
One more, and then...
Buenas.
My question is, we understand that the commitments under the OGP are not binding. And this is a concern to the extent that a proper monitoring of the commitments should be allowed from the state and from civil society, considering that whenever there is a change of government in Latin America, there is an entire deinstitutionalization and we start from scratch again. So how can we track this so that in the next generation of the OGP there is a better control and surveillance for better performance, including rural, marginal areas and the areas of indigenous communities?
Very much. That was excellent. Really, really good contributions. Lots of, I think this point of going to local level and subnational is coming through very, very strongly, involving the judiciary and having other branches of government involved is something that some of you have already been doing. And institutionalizing the spaces, but also OGP through elections, given this big year of elections coming up for the region, is something that I know is high on everyone's mind. One of the things I love about OGP is it's very much a learning environment. So what I want to ask as a final question for each of you, just briefly, and we'll go by country this time, starting with Colombia. I just want to hear from you, like, is there something you've learned from either this session or over the past 2 days that you're taking away that you will go and act on in your role in your country? Is there anything new or any new approaches that you think could be applied? I think that would be a helpful way just to finish off this session. So we'll start and we'll go across in order.
Bueno,
Yes, actually I take many lessons. I think we can take many learning efforts in this process of exchanging and listening. This recommendation of a mid-term plan per country is an interesting recommendation that was made in our discussions here. And also what Felipe said, this increased articulation with the academia. That is very interesting construction built upon knowledge and concepts, not just the theory, but also based on practice. Thank you. I actually take 2 lessons from here. One, yesterday during lunch, I was walking around and I sat at a table with people from the Ministry of Finance from Argentina, and it was fun because they were saying, we, as always, we've been years saying we can leave this information, we can involve the citizen here and there, and all of a sudden this is the new fad. And someone has come up with this great idea, and now they said we have this great idea. And I feel that that same thing happens everywhere. So now it comes to the point on how to actually create spaces, how to activate collective intelligence so that people that are already working in various political lines and civil society, how the spaces are created so that they can actually move forward, because the ideas are there, have always been there. And another thing, in this creation of spaces, it's very good to have peers in other countries that are experiencing the same, going through the same experience, so that, for instance, one Secretary of Transparency can talk to other secretaries of transparency. You've done this, we've done that, and that is extremely valuable. Shared lessons. A follow-up on Nicolas' remarks, the Transparency Secretary was asked what was his opinion about the establishment of a network of OGP ministers. And then we realized that the situation is that there is high energy in summits like this, and the challenge is to maintain it throughout the year. So, for Colombia, we believe it would be great to put on the record what good practices we've identified, which are the cases of success, so that other countries can use them, because we are not going to read everybody's action plans, so the more summarized the information, the better. There was a question, this issue about the territorial and the national. In our secretariat, we've understood that there are different levels of maturity, and we have to embrace the different levels, accompany those who are starting, strengthen those that have made more progress. That is a challenge. But again, it would be great to work with the civil society that is working on the field and knows the local problems better than we do. There was a question made by a judiciary representative. Let me answer that, because we are proud in Colombia of having a court in the second action plan. We've included the State Council. Apparently, the commitment looks simple. The Council should be accountable for the historical performance and what were its goals for the future. Well, these courts are very remote for the citizen, and the citizens do not understand what they do. So through this exercise, the courts go to the citizen to explain what they do and why they do it. And this council has a commitment for the third plan to continue with these explanations to the citizens why the judiciary is so important, even more so now in the post-conflict period.
So 2 big comments or takeaways from me. The first is we've got a lot of work to do. I look around the room and I hear all these incredible stories. It's very inspiring. For me, though, we're just barely starting to capture the potential of open government. Our democracies, our ability to serve our citizens, I think are fundamentally undermined when we don't realize that potential, when we don't pursue the opportunities, and when we don't take the lessons from our counterparts around the world and bring those home and try to make our government more effective, more accountable, better equipped to really enable people to participate. People power is incredibly, when we look at public problems, and we invite people to come in and help us deal with those public problems, not even to help, but to solve those problems, I think that we have an incredibly untapped potential here. We talk a lot about digital tools in the Government of Canada right now. I think that we need to bring digital into open government more effectively. We look at the tools like artificial intelligence. They're kind of scary, but they also have the potential to lower the barriers to accessing public problems and accessing government more than they ever have in the past. I think it's incumbent upon us as a community of open government leaders to embrace those tools and really look at how they can make the lives of our citizens better. So my first big takeaway is we got a lot of work to do. The second one is I think I've gotten a little bit of a validation around some of the priorities that we've been looking at for our co-chairmanship of the OGP. I'm committing to continue to be obsessive about impact. Already I know that I'm driving the team nuts, but I think that it's really important that when we invest, when we come and we spend time in beautiful cities like Buenos Aires, that we're actually getting things that will make the lives of our people better. So again, without at the risk of waxing lyrical here, I think it really does matter what we're doing here, but let's make sure that when we tell that story, it's totally unambiguous. To do that, we need to measure the impact of our work.
Thanks. Yeah, I kind of want to echo what Jamie said. I've learned a lot here, and one of the really cool aspects of the right to information, transparency, open government generally, is that global leadership on these issues is so devolved. So if you look at the different thematic sectors, you find leadership in different places. On open contracting, you can look at what's being done in Paraguay or Honduras, which is typically miles ahead of what you'll see in the traditional democratic West. You look at what's done on the right to information in Mexico, their proactive publication scheme, their appeals mechanism for refusals of access. It's this incredibly innovative stuff. And as somebody whose background is in human rights development and who's come from a situation of going to the Global South and looking to build better models, it's very cool to see the best models of this stuff emerging in the Global South, and to be able to come back to Canada and be pointing to models from South America, Central America, as well as Southeast Asia as areas where we can learn. So this has been a very cool experience for me, and it's been great to be immersed in these kinds of systems, and I look forward to engaging going forward.
So maybe three things. First thing would be the way that I think civil society over the years, as the OGP has evolved and kind of matured, has had to develop new skills as well. Mainly negotiation skills. So we're talking about changing power relationships with institutions, with government, which can be quite daunting sometimes. And probably a lot of civil society activists that are involved in the OGP don't have professional negotiation skills, but they've kind of become brokers and negotiators. So I think there's a role there for the OGP and maybe the support unit to provide some support next year, given that there's going to be so many different action plans being developed. So we should connect together and not fall into our own kind of national silos as we develop these plans. Second thing, on the topic of co-implementation, I think there's probably a need, and from the conversations that I've been able to have here, when we talk about co-implementation, there's probably a kind of an open government kind of co-implementation project management kind of module that could exist where civil society could have a role there. Because when you talk to government kind of leaders that are trying to implement different commitments, they all face very kind of similar challenges, and they want to connect with civil society, but they don't necessarily know how to do that. And through a kind of a project management approach, we could be looking at more kind of agile methodologies and iterative processes, and really looking at kind of prototyping different approaches, as opposed to relying on like a 2-year kind of cycle before we can actually measure impact. And the third thing is maybe more of a kind of a call to action on the topic of leading by example for Canada. I think we need to be able to draw from the best of what's going on internationally. For example, in the region, we see open parliament, and there are commitments and excellent examples of open parliament commitments, and we don't have open parliament commitments in Canada. So we need to remedy that. So by leading by example, we need to draw from what's happening elsewhere in the world and make sure that Canada's national action plan is truly ambitious and reflects kind of the best of what we can see elsewhere.
Gracias.
Honestly, I could come up with a whole list of things that I've learned over the last 2 days and things that I have grasped, but I'm not going to come up with a list, don't worry. I'm just going to focus on 2 points because there were 2 subjects that resonated in me and that I saw that emerged in different comments by the audience. One is the subnational context and the other one is the implementation of the follow-up on the implementation of commitments. As regards the subnational context, I wonder what an ambitious commitment at the subnational level will be like, and how can we become more ambitious, and how can we undertake subnational commitments in this national plan. So you can look at the plan for Argentina and you can say, well, this commitment is not so ambitious. But you would say to me, well, if you think about a certain province, the fact or provinces that are lagging behind in this area that have not yet started to work on these processes, the fact that they get involved in these processes, they open up this Pandora box, is an ambitious goal in itself. It is an ambitious commitment for the national plan. So how can we include more of these commitments in the plan without having plans that turn into shopping lists, where you put everything in there, or everything that stakeholders can come up with? And then this leads us to another problem. How can we introduce cross-cutting commitments that go through different jurisdictions without this happening from the top to the bottom? So we are going to say something, and which jurisdiction wants to take this commitment? Perhaps I'm asking you to reinvent the wheel, but perhaps you should find some way of striking a balance between process, co-creation, and autonomy to come up with these commitments and to make sure that these commitments have a more systemic view of the plans. And the other issue that I wanted to bring up here has to do with implementation. There are different ways of meeting the OGP concepts. OGP can be a productive platform to have an impact and to open up government policies. You can be a good student, and at the end of the process, you can have a minimum marginal impact on government openness. So in addition to looking at the quality and the depth of commitments, the themes, the relevance, as criteria that we usually assess as assessors and also as implementers, we need to look at these other part of commitments, because sometimes we think about cooperation as something fantastic and we are going to change the world with that, and we forget about monitoring implementation of commitments because we are already worried about the subsequent co-creation process. So I think when we talk about ambition here, since we started this panel, ambition should also be applied to implementation. You can have a minimalistic or a truly ambitious implementation process, and I think that we need to move forward in that direction. One of the ideas that I take home with me is that open government is much more than an action plan. That it should be a tool that enables us to discuss a new way of understanding the relationship between the government and its citizens, a new understanding of a more deliberative and a more open democracy. Let me share with you a story. We were meeting here. Perhaps you heard about our campaign for the ombudsperson. And when we were gathering here, we received a note from the chair of the Senate, who belongs to the ruling party. And he told us that they couldn't set up an implementation process to choose the ombudsperson because the ombudsperson has to be chosen quickly. The position has been vacant for 8 years. And by doing that, we would be breaching the law because there is no participatory mechanism established in the law. So I think that the big challenge for us who believe in open government, and I'm talking about officials like Natalia and academic people who are really convinced, is to break down that barrier in the process and use it as a tool to evangelize among decision makers so that big decisions are made differently. Otherwise, I believe that in a few years we are going to gather again and we will regret that this idea of open government was something that has faded away over time. So that is the big challenge that I think that we need to step up to.
Cerrar. Así como es difícil.
To conclude, as I heard Inés, she was looking at me while she spoke. I don't know if you are asking me, but you are asking us, actually, because we're working with civil society, and one of the big lessons was this work on the third plan. Open government, although it is one of the main lines of work of the Secretariat, but not the only one, it has a great potential in this work with civil society. The team from the Finance Ministry of Argentina, obviously we try to reach out to all ministries and bring them into the plan. But this ministry is organizing a seminar on budget transparency, and it was precisely last year where the civil society representatives submitted this idea of openness, and from this dialogue with civil society, we had 2 commitments with finance in the action plan. So if they had not been there attending that civil society organized forum, they would haven't reached out to us and wouldn't have had this hyper-productive response, irrespective of this fact that we invite everybody. If that minor instance of dialogue had not taken place, we wouldn't have these 2 commitments from finance there. So this is a collaboration, literally, with the various obstacles and different paces of progress. And answering to the question from the Haiti representative, yes, Argentina went through a process of transition, and a person of my team will be in an afternoon panel talking about that, because the Americas region will go through 8 presidential elections in the next 12 months, and it's still a challenge to go through such processes. We've not done this great, but it was quite good. So we have an experience to tell you that could be of use to you or not, but we will be happy to share with you.
I'm afraid, but I have here a list of at least 20 takeaways. So I have my own personal mini conference report, which was my secret objective of that session. But more seriously, I think, you know, way too much to summarize, but if I could just leave one call to action. This point from Inés, I really love this point, that we may have now a lot of good students in OGP. You know, people have the forums, people are doing the action plans more on time, the commitments are more specific, but what do we actually need to do collectively to mean that we're using it really ambitiously to tackle the really tough political challenges that people care about? So it's not enough to be a good student in OGP purely by the process of your membership. The next generation has to be more ambitious because, and maybe I'm just picking the points because they came at the end, because otherwise, as Renzo says, there's a risk for all of us that in 2 or 3 years' time, the energy will fall out of this movement, and we won't have the clear impact and results that citizens care about to sustain us and keep us going. So I really love this final point on how we use this much more ambitiously. And the reality of next year for the partnership globally, not just in the region, is we do have 70 of these action plans being co-created. I totally agree open government is much more than an OGP action plan, but the thing that makes it real in OGP and not just rhetoric is having strong action plans. So all of the 15 local governments will be doing new plans next year. Over 50 of the national governments will be doing new plans next year. And that is really our window of opportunity as a community to collectively raise ambition in the partnership. That's the challenge for all of us. So this has been a really helpful set of lessons from 3 of our countries in the region, but I hope we'll also be taking these lessons globally because a lot of this resonates way beyond the Americas. So thank you very much for keeping this, I hope, dynamic, even though we have 9 panelists. I know everyone is now ready for coffee, but I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you very much.